Ago. Hello, everyone, and good afternoon, and welcome to another author interview here on Tales from the Wandering Scribe. I'm Gabriel Garcia, the Wandering Scribe himself, and joining us today is an author all the way from New York, making their official debuts here on the show. Now, my guest has been a writer for as long as she can remember. Ever since childhood, she has outlined stories and dreamed of prompts. The world of Tunsealior, I probably butchered that, so I apologize.
Whereas,
Home to her debut novel was thought of while she was an undergraduate student, and she has been whittling away at the idea for the better part of a decade. She is thrilled to share Tamora, Marin, and Racynth's story with the world and hopes that all will fall in love with her novel too. And when she's not writing, she spends time with her husband and daughter, often baking, crocheting, and thrifting. She does her best writing with a mug of hot tea with a healthy amount of vanilla and sugar and her dog at her feet. And she's currently working on the next book in her saga and outlining a few side projects. So make sure to stick around until the end to find out more. So without further ado, let's give a huge round of applause to today's guest all the way from New York, author L.A. Garnett. L.A., welcome to the show.
thank you so much. I appreciate the invite. It's awesome.
Awesome, L.A. So before we dive into your novel and the series you're working on, is there anything further you would like to add about your background to our viewers and listeners?
It's pretty, all encompassing. Honestly, I write fantasy, romance, and a little bit of horror, and I'm very excited to continue my series. The next book is coming out this fall, so this is well timed.
Awesome. Well, that's incredible, L.A. And as a little teaser for your upcoming book coming out later this year, what can you tell us about the saga itself, starting from the first book, and what we can expect from the next book this year?
Absolutely. So the Tunsealiorian Saga is a fantasy world, set in a fantasy world. The Spiraling, the first book, follows three perspective characters, Tamora, Racynth, and Marin, as they fight to protect their families and their values from the influence of a very corrupt city lord who seems to have his sights dead set on destroying them. And it's a world of elemental magic. Rebellion is brewing, and there's darkness that's threatening, everyone on the continent, and that builds in the first book and it continues throughout. So it's a very exciting world to be writing in.
That's amazing. That's incredible. And I also read from your bio that this is something that you've been working on for a very long time, since your undergraduate years. But I am curious, would you consider that the beginning of your passion for creating stories, or did this come about earlier in your life?
Yeah, I've definitely been writing, like I said in my bio, for as long as I can remember. Interesting. My main character has always been named Tamora in all of these little snippets throughout my life. Usually they never made it past 10 pages or so. And the country she lived in was always Tunsealior. It just took me a bit to figure out exactly what her story was going to be. And I'm very happy with where it ended up. And I finally decided to kickstart it and turn it from something more than just a hobby that I was doing for fun. After my daughter was born, I wanted her to have a mom who accomplished her goals and did creative projects and put them out in the world and was a little vulnerable in that way. So I decided to just go for it and find an editor and get the book published. So it had been finished for a little bit at that point, the first book. So I was just sitting on it, waiting and querying and everything. And I'm very happy with the decision to publish it and have it out in the world for people to read.
Awesome, L.A. That's incredible. Now, I'm curious, what would you consider the definitive aha moment for you when you realize that you want to take your passion and build a career off of it, to build your brand as the author?
Yeah, it was definitely realizing that this story that I had written was worth my time. I had a lot of little snippets that, like I said, they'd never gotten very far. They were fun, but they weren't entirely like tangible stories, but realizing that there was some true potential with this story and with this world, and the characters specifically, and that they had space to grow and become characters that I thought people could really relate to. And then also, like I mentioned, just feeling very motivated personally to get out in the world and to have a physical book that I could show my daughter and say, you can do the things that you dream of doing.
Absolutely. And that's a little fun question before we go into like the construction of this series.
Yeah.
I've had a lot of guests on the show, especially parents who have been on the show who have, written their first book or their series. And what I've seen is that a lot of them who write their first book, especially if they're parents, they do so with many intents, but one of them is that they want a book that they can share with their children down the road when they're old enough to read said book. Is that kind of the same way for you and your family?
A bit. The book is definitely written with adults in mind, just in terms of tone, and there's a good amount of violence in it.
Right.
So it's something that I absolutely would like her to read at some point. I think it's a good book. I think it'd be worth her time. But I'll probably write one in the next couple of years, more geared towards younger kids that she can read. It's a little more developmentally appropriate.
Of course.
But yeah, I have her in mind, and I'm hoping that in the future it's something that she enjoys and is proud that her mom did.
Awesome. And that's actually something that another guest shared on my show a year ago, where, they want their books to be seen as some form of like legacy or inheritance for, the children to take on and to learn more about, what the parents have, like, the stories they've left behind. And that's ultimately something that we're going to be talking about later in the interview when we talk about, the business side of being an author. But before we get to that, let's talk about the creation of the first book in this saga of yours. So walk me through it, LA. You've now decided that enough is enough. You're going to write this story. You're either at your computer or going old school with a pad and pencil, and you're just jotting down the idea of the story, the world itself. Now, when you began writing this, or possibly plotting or planning, what were the goals you had for yourself as the author, as well as the promise that you were making to your future readers?
Yeah, I wanted it to be a story that is just a little bit different from like your average, like what people think of as fantasy, which is still, even though it's been quite a few years, it's still the sword and fantasy or sword and sorcery of the like 80s is primarily what people think of.
Right.
I wanted it to be a little different, and I know I'm not the only person who has that goal in mind. But I tried very hard to create a world and a story that was new and didn't rely on like the hallmarks of the genre. So like there's not any dwarves or elves or things like that in the saga, and definitely not in the first book. And so when I was writing the first book, because I was trying to make things different, and I have like this elemental magic aspect, and it needed quite a bit of explanation, just as you do when you're introducing a new concept to readers. So the spiraling is set entirely in one city over the course of a single week, and I wanted that part of it to be very familiar to readers. So Arengate, where it's set, is a pretty classic European port city, because I wanted readers to have at least something tangible, like familiar, that they could be like, oh, okay, I don't have to think too hard about this part, because there's so many other new things. And so really, I sat down and I just decided like I need to research a lot of things. And that's why it took so long for me to write the first one is I was also in grad school at the time, so I was a little distracted, but I wanted to really spend my time in researching different aspects of the world and different people in our own world, and how I could put that into the book to make sure that it was relatable and felt really built out and real.
Absolutely. And, I understand, the balance of, academic and, personal writing. I began writing my first book when I was in graduate school as well. And, it is a balancing act, to commit to your academics and take care of those first, and then find enough time to write.
Yeah.
Now, I am curious, LA, would you consider yourself a pantser or a plotter when it comes to your personal writing?
Yeah, it's definitely changed a little bit over the years. When I first sat down to write, it definitely pantsed the whole way through. Like I wasn't really concerned with having like a solid idea of where I was going. I just wanted to get the story.
Mm,
It's changed slightly. Like when I was writing book two, I did have a general outline. I knew roughly what beats I wanted to hit. But that was maybe like, 4 to 6 major plot points that I needed to hit across the whole 400 pages. So there's a lot of room for me to make things up in the middle there.
mm.
So I've definitely settled somewhere in the middle. But from the beginning, I just had an idea and I just went with it. And that draft was messy. There was a lot going on, a lot of different good ideas and a lot of different really bad ideas that I just had to whittle out with editing. So I think it's gotten a little more, finalized. I'm somewhere in the middle, which just kind of feels like a lame answer, but it's definitely a mix for me at this point.
That makes sense, and that is completely fair. And every author has their own path of how they get the story across. They sometimes have like a clear outline that they don't deviate from beginning to end. And as you said, LA, some people have like the general plots that they want to hit. Like this happens in Act 1, this happens in Act 2, this happens in Act 3, and
Yeah,
then I just got to fill in the gaps of what leads to which
absolutely.
at the end of the day can take a very, very long time because
Mhm.
as authors, we're always going to be looking at the same story with different lenses and we're going to be inspired by different things. And on that topic of, inspiration and, of course, inspiring others, what was the reaction like from friends and family who
Yeah.
learned about this project you were working on? And ultimately, did they kind of not understand, but the goal that you set out and the expectations that you wanted for the story,
Mhm.
they were able to get that from the initial draft?
Yeah, absolutely. I've been very lucky to receive a lot of really positive feedback from friends and family, especially. My husband reads all of my books, well, all my fantasy books. The romance ones my friends read. But I've been very lucky to receive some very good feedback. And I have a great, writing group that reads a lot of my work as well. Um, and yeah, I think, from what I've heard, my characters feel real. They feel, like three-dimensional. People have been impressed by the scope of world building, but not like overwhelmed by it. I wanted like
Mm,
my goal was to have a balance. Like I'm really inspired, for example, by Tolkien, but like I didn't want readers to have to go through like 10 pages of descriptions of trees
right.
before they got to the plot. So, there's a balance of things. And from what I've heard, um, I struck that, which is all I really wanted.
That's amazing, Ellie, and that's actually very good. And this actually kind of leads into the next question, which I could call the first of many reflective questions.
Mhm.
So, to give context to this question, LA, what I've learned from meeting with a lot of authors on the show, especially those that are just starting with their first book or their first series, there is that hesitancy to share with people beyond our inner circle because it's our baby. It's something that we have worked on for many years and it's taken on many shapes and forms. And in the digital age, for us as authors, it's a blessing and a curse. On
Mhm.
one side, we're able to meet and reach out to our readers, our fans, as well as fellow authors in the genres that we like to write in and build rapport, network, and just grow. On the other side, we unfortunately do leave ourselves exposed to a lot of spam, trolls, hate speech, and a lot of negativity. And that can be very detrimental to an author's mental health and overall
Mhm.
well being. And also, the dreaded imposter syndrome is always going to be there, waiting in the background, waiting for its chance to strike. So I'm curious, LA, when you began writing the first book and then now working on the second book, did you ever have moments of heightened anxiety and or imposter syndrome? And what has disciplined you to continue with this series when some would argue maybe just stick with the first book And if the feedback is positive, work on the next one in the series.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I absolutely have experienced imposter syndrome and feeling like, the nerves of just creating something and putting it out into the world and knowing other people are going to see it. It's a very nerve-wracking experience at times. But I write ultimately because I enjoy writing and I enjoy telling stories. And this particular story just called to me in a way that none of the others had before. And so I'm just driven by that continual curiosity of, I know generally, where the story is going to go, but I don't know all the details yet, even though I'm the one creating the world. And so that curiosity of just seeing where the story is going to take me is truly why I keep writing. I write because I like it. I wouldn't sit down every day and write for 2 hours if I didn't enjoy doing that. And so, ultimately, I know that not everyone's going to like my writing, and that's entirely fine. Reviews are for people who are looking to see if they want to read my book. I've already written it. I already know I like it. I don't particularly need to look at the reviews to know that I enjoy my work. So I'm just going to keep kind of trucking along and finish my series. And if some other people enjoy it, then that's fabulous. I'm glad.
Awesome. And that's a really good mindset to have, LA. That is incredible. And this is another question, rather a fun opinion answer that I've been asking my guests on the show. I'd like to hear your thoughts on it. And for context for this question, a previous guest that was on the show, Jasmine Young, mentioned on her social media that we are in a new age, a golden age of creativity, whether you are an author, a musician, an artist, content creator, what have you. And her reason for that was, during the lockdown years, the COVID years, it pushed everybody to become more creative, to not be so isolated. And I definitely agree with that. As I mentioned before, I began my graduate career around the height of the COVID lockdown, and also began my writing around the same time. So it pushed me to expand upon my creativity and honestly just break the monotonous, the boredom. But as I look past the COVID years and asking my authors this, I've been getting a lot of differing answers on this question. Some people have said that we are not in a golden age or a renaissance of some kind. Some have said that we are on our way to that golden age, that new era. But then some have gone even further and said that while there is an increase in independent publishing because the publishing industry has changed within the last 20 years, that doesn't mean there's a lot of creative books out there in the sense that they were made with the sole intent of inspiring others to write or telling a good story. They were just made to exist and just be out there in the world. So, LA, in your opinion, do you believe that we are in a new age or a renaissance of some kind for independent creators, or are we not?
That's a really good question. I mean, it's definitely, I definitely agree that for people who are already inclined to be creative, being in lockdown situations was definitely like it was a crucible for a lot of people in terms of, it's all you could do. I definitely got a good bit of writing done in those first few months. But it's also, it's a good point that there's a lot of books, there's a lot of works of art, there's a lot of content available now that people are creating, and some people put a lot of effort into it and some people don't. That's just kind of the nature of being a creative person. It's some people are going to put their whole heart and soul into something, and some people are just going to try to produce something that they think will sell. There's benefits to both of them. I wouldn't say that one is necessarily more deserving of being called creative than the other. Like, I read tons of books that I absolutely get cranked out and I enjoy them just fine. So I think it's just a different aspect of publishing and creating things than what we've seen before, and just using all the technology available to us is I think, really beneficial for that. People are always going to be creative. I think just breaking down barriers and letting people publish things that might not have seen the light of day is a really valuable thing that's happening now.
Right.
So I think I think it's definitely interesting to see where things are going and see what's available to readers.
Absolutely, 100%. And then on the topic of, technology in the creative sphere, I haven't asked these questions to guests in a while, but I definitely think it is important to talk about. And of course, that's referring to, ChatGPT, AI, and how it's kind of taking over the publishing industry. Now, I will be the first to say that I have used not ChatGPT, but I have used Grammarly in the sense to, help format my outlines, as well as other AI simulators when it comes to creating characters or stuff like that. I'll be the first to admit it. I use that to help, get a rough idea. Do I tweak it? Absolutely, because 9 times out of 10, the program is not going to be 100% correct. Yeah. So I have to tailor it to how I would write. But at the end of the day, the story that I write is going to be my own voice. Yeah. But I know that's a very big discussion in the publishing world. So, Ellie, I'd like to hear your thoughts on authors using, AI software in some degree. And in your opinion, what would consider to be a healthy balance of technology like this, but also not disregarding your own creativity?
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, just 1 minute. I think my husband's going to walk with my daughter and they're going to come back and I have to move. So just 1 second. This is like one of those moments that you cut out.
You're good. You're good.
Hold on. I have
in your opinion, like what would be considered like a healthy balance of the two, as well as your thoughts on, authors using AI in their writing?
Absolutely. It's a good question because AI is obviously becoming prevalent in writing. I personally don't use it in my writing. I do a lot of, and honestly, my writing and my world building is just how I like to spend my free time, and I whittle away at these little ideas. And just to me, like that little moment is very calming, and using something else that's not like my little notebook or my, note processor online is just, it doesn't have that same effect for me. So I see in my world building no real like place for AI. That's not to say like words autocorrect. Some people consider that an AI. That's autocorrect. That's been around a long time. I need people to tell me how to spell. I write. That doesn't mean I know how to spell words properly. But in terms of using like generative AI in writing, I find it disappointing, especially when, I see these posts of people finding generate like AI prompts in a book that is available, like someone's published it on Amazon, on Kindle or something like that. And that's just disappointing because that's not what you want when you're reading a book. And it feels like, you're not putting that effort and that time. And it's not going to take everyone, 10 years to write a book. Some people really crank them out and they can get a book out in 4 months. And I think that's amazing. And I think that effort that people put into that, it's kind of sad to see people prefer to use something that generates the whole story for them instead. I think using AI as a support to life makes sense. Like for me, art is for people. People make art, like a computer can't make art in the same way that a person can, but a computer can absolutely manage your calendar and like do all of these administrative tasks for you and free up your time so that you can do the art. It's just we haven't quite hit that balance yet. I'll be really curious to see where it goes, and I really hope we can find a good balance for people, but we're not quite there yet.
Absolutely. And that's a really good point, LA, this balance between the two. And it's a discussion that will probably take a long time. And, you're very right about, some books that have those prompts in it, like in the book, and no reader wants to see that. In fact, I remember a good friend of mine actually posted an article that was about that, where a book in Amazon had the
Yeah.
prompt and was like, that's very unfortunate. That it need to be removed, and it's sad. But unfortunately, that is the state that we are in. But that doesn't mean that we can't change it. We absolutely can. And this now goes into the business portion, which is probably my favorite segment of the interview, the business side of being an author. Now, LA, I am curious. When you began drafting the first story in this saga, did you have an idea of how you wanted to publish your book? Did you want to go indie? Did you want to go hybrid? Did you want to go traditional? And how much research did you really dive into until you figured out which path was the right for you?
Yeah, I definitely, I had that dream that I was a teenager when I first had the ideas. So I had that dream that I think everyone has when they think of being an author, which is getting picked up by a major publishing company. And,
Yes.
your first book is going to be a major bestseller and you're going to become, a great well-known author and get adaptations and all that.
Yes.
It very quickly became apparent to me that that wasn't realistic. But, I finished the first book. I sat on it for a bit, probably 2 years or so, just querying it and trying to get an agent and seeing if there was any interest and, editing it as I went.
Right.
Through that whole process. And ultimately, I still believe that it could be a very good traditionally published series, but I decided to just take ownership of my series and say, I want this out here. I think it's worth the time. So I'm going to self-publish it. So I decided to go the self-publishing route personally. It allowed me to really make sure the book was exactly what I wanted it to be. And I'm not terrible at the social media side of things. I'm not great at marketing by any means. I'm a behind the scenes writer rather than someone who's like really passionate about marketing, but I'm learning. So that part of the business side of things has been really interesting. I think part of what helps me with that side of things is I am curious about how all of this works and willing to learn the skills that I need to do all of that side of the business. And so it's been really interesting figuring out the balance of, I spend this much time writing, I spend this much time building out what I'm going to post on social media about it, figuring out if I want to pay for ads, like that whole process has been really interesting. But it's definitely not exactly what I pictured for myself when I sat down to write this, 10 years ago, but I'm really happy with where I've ended up. And I'll write other books that, are not in this series that I'll try to query again. I'm not super concerned about all of that. Like if I want my books out in the world, they'll get there one way or the other. And I just want to be proud of what I'm creating.
That's amazing, LA. That is incredible to hear. And I know you mentioned earlier in the interview that your book is more so towards a adult audience, mature audience, because of the themes and the plot element. And I think that's an important discussion to have when it comes about, understanding our readership and understanding our audience.
Yeah.
Now, for me, I've always viewed the audience and the readership as very different. And the reason why I think that is because, the audience is the large pool that every author strives to hit, whether that's the epic fantasy genre, the romance fantasy genre, or whatever genre that you're writing in or trying to get your foot in. It's going to have its audience with its own set of expectations and rules such as that.
Absolutely.
But readership is, in my opinion, very different from that. But before we talk on readership, let's dive a little bit more into the audience. So for you, LA, did you already have a good idea of your audience when you were drafting book 1 and had to stay the same up to book 2? And ultimately, in your opinion, when should an author really know their audience? The drafting phase or the marketing phase?
I think when you're writing a book, like when I write a book, I write it for myself. I wouldn't keep doing it if I didn't want to be there, and if I didn't enjoy the story, it wouldn't go as far as it does.
Right.
Once I finish a draft and I start looking at it, and maybe second draft or third draft when I'm going through edits, like that's where I start to kind of keep in mind, like, did I hit the genre expectations? Is this like, how am I going to be marketing this? Like that's when I'm getting closer to the final project, I start pulling out quotes that I think will be helpful. And with that kind of eye, I really need to keep in mind of who's going to be seeing this, what part of this is going to be interesting to an audience. Like for me, for my this series in particular, it's a fantasy. So I definitely want to make sure that I'm focusing on that, what makes it unique in fantasy. What world building I think would be really, eye catching if you see it. Are the characters some people who are going to grab an audience and really pull them into the story? And so it's primarily like that final editing phase where I have a marketing view on it. But what am I pulling out? What am I going to be using that's already present in the story? If there's not a ton there that I think will be really eye-catching, to an audience, I might think about that when I'm looking at the draft and going, oh, do I need to add some pieces that, like, is this too different? Like, not too different, but is this, not interesting enough am I not pulling out enough things that are going to be interesting to an audience? And, thinking about my scenes and maybe what could change to be a little more compelling.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's very true. That is very true. So now when we look at the readership, again, I think that readership is different from the audience because the audience is, of course, the larger group that, every author is drilled into them saying that you have to hit your target audience. But sometimes that's not necessarily doable for some authors. Sometimes it's the readership, those individual people. As you said, you were very passionate about your story, and I would imagine that the readers that you are marketing towards are people almost like you, like the types of stories that you love to write are the people that you want to market towards. And that can be a little challenging. And then in the readership, you, of course, have the 4 classifications. You have middle grade, which is for children, YA, which is young adult, NA, which is relatively new, which is new adult, and AF, which is adult fiction, which has its own set of rules and expectations across all 4. And of course, stories can change over time during the writing phase. An example, let's say you wrote a story that was YA, but as you began redeveloping it, editing it, you realize, oh, this is actually more so for adult. So Ellie, I'm curious. I know you've mentioned before that this story is for, a mature adult audience, but at any point, did some plot elements come up in the story that were making a detour in the narrative to where it's like, oh, this is no longer adult fiction. I'm now kind of entering unknown waters.
Yeah, there was definitely time, like it's always been, I've always pictured an adult audience in mind. Like I wanted it to be enjoyable for readers of my own age. So it was like, in my 20s, and I want people, 20s and up to really enjoy this story and feel like they've invested the proper amount of time, and that they're getting, they're getting what I promised out of the book. There were times when I was writing it that it was, especially in those early drafts, it didn't have the stakes that many adult fiction novel like series have. So I needed to kind of build things up, make things a little more like weighty, because it was feeling a little light on the conflict, light on the stakes. And not that made it feel younger, because obviously there are YA books that have intense stakes in their plots, but like there was a time in early development where it's just I was like, what's making this a story? Like what's making this something that an adult at the end of their workday will want to sit down and read it and find it entertaining? Because I feel like there's so many things that ask for our attention that especially for adult fiction. Like there just needs to be a big draw, because we have a lot of options of what we could read and what we could watch. And I wanted it to really be that for people. So it was always for adults. It was just kind of finding that happy place of what makes this worth someone's time.
Absolutely, 100%. And I think another thing which is important to note is, of course, I think you touched on it earlier when you said that, you know, your writing has been inspired by, you know, authors of the past. You mentioned J.R. Tolkien, which is like, to a lot of fantasy authors and authors in general, is like one of the titans, the godfathers of the publishing industry. All the credit to him and his stories. But I definitely feel, you know, as authors, we find ourselves in this, you know, unknown territory when we are creating a story, we're writing it, and we input things that we have always been inspired by other stories. And we find ourselves in this tightrope situation where on one end, we're balancing our individuality as authors because we want to sell that. On the other side, we have the stories that we grew up, that we fell in love, the authors, and, you know, paying respects to the titans of the industry, especially if that is the industry you're trying to get into for publishing. And I think another thing to note is whenever an author, and I've learned this from a good friend of mine, he brought this to the point that not a lot of authors take this into consideration, that if you're writing in a genre, let's say fantasy, people have an expectation of how fantasy stories are supposed to go beat for beat. No matter if it's romance fantasy, epic fantasy, dark fantasy, there's a certain narrative structure that is coherent in all stories. And for a lot of authors, that can be challenging because we want to showcase our individuality. We want to turn the story on its head. We don't want to make it too new that's going to lose the reader, because we don't want that at the end of the day. So for you, LA, how have you been able to balance these two respectfully and not feel overwhelmed by the pressure of trying to tell a good story?
Yeah. Something that's been really valuable for me to keep in mind is that, you know, every story has in some way been told before. It's, you know, you're creating new like trappings for it. You're dressing it up a little and making it yours, but the core of the story, every single one of these tropes already exists. That's why they're tropes. Humans just tell stories a certain way. And so that's been just really helpful for me to keep in mind, of just to kind of break my own sense of like, I'm creating something completely new and exciting. And it's like, no, you're doing something people have done. It's important to have a balance where you feel very proud of your work and you're doing something, you know, that is different. It's different enough that you felt it valuable enough to write it and get it out in the world, and you're selling it as something new and exciting. I truly do think my series is that, but also keeping in mind of like, people are going to find a lot of this familiar, and that's important. You know, honestly, you can't have a story that's entirely new and exciting without just it being incredibly overwhelming to readers. It's important to have a balance where you have aspects of that fantasy, you know, genre that people always expect, and then you add a little bit new. That's, you know, like I said before, that's why I have these newer ideas of, you know, the magic system in my world that's new. It needed more explanation, and so I balanced it with a very simple backdrop, and the setting is, you know, important. Obviously the entire story happens there, but for this particular book and the spiraling, I needed it to be something recognizable so that audiences weren't completely torn and you know, trying to just pick up the pieces of what they understood about the world. I know I've read books like that where it's just like a new phrase, a new, you know, made up language every other word, and it's like I put that book down within 50 pages. You know, you just can't do that to people. So you need to rely on the tropes and the familiar to make your unique story shine. It's that kind of balance that is what makes stories really stand out.
Well said, LA. Well said. And I also think another thing to talk about, which is important in the publishing industry, is, of course, networking and building our own team, especially if you are an indie author. I've shared this numerous times on numerous interviews. Being an indie author is good if you understand what you're getting yourself into. Yes, you do own all your stories, which is great. However, it's important to understand it's all on you.
Yeah.
If you have your own team, that means you have to pay your editor, you have to pay your cover artist, you have to pay the company that is going to be formatting your books, whether that is Ingram Sparks or a printing house or whatever.
Yeah.
It takes a lot of money. And then to balance all that out, that is, another business savvy trick, balancing one's finances. So it's important to talk about, networking and stuff like that. So this is going to be a two-part question, LA. So the first part is, in your opinion, how important is it for authors to really understand that networking is an essential tool for an author?
I think it's very important. I mean, it is ultimately it's those in-person connections and those real connections that you form either, at in-person events or through social media, which is a great way to meet new people, especially if you don't know anyone personally who've published. Like, that's vital. It's hugely important just to get a sense of what to expect, especially if you're just starting out. And also, in terms of sales, like, you should do those in-person book events, because ultimately, social media is great for meeting people. It's not a great sales tool. It's great for people who like who you are and want to get a sense of who you are to be able to showcase that. But you're not going to get, unless you go really viral on TikTok, you're not going to get a ton of sales from, posting on Instagram, for example. So it's important to find a balance of how you're networking with people. I don't necessarily practice what I preach. I don't get out all that much. I've got a 2-year-old and, a full-time job outside of writing. So
right.
I definitely see the value of it. I've talked to a few authors who have been super helpful. Like Meg Smitherman gave me some phenomenal advice when I reached out. She's been amazing. And then Scarlett Morrow has been just like really phenomenal and so kind with shouting out my work over the last few months. I really appreciate like personalized touches like that. And it's really sweet to see the network of authors that has been created online. And while I might not tap into that a ton or, talk very much with people at this point in my writing journey, there's a huge value in it. And I would definitely encourage people to reach out to other authors, see how they're doing what they're doing, especially if it's someone that you're trying to replicate the success that they're having.
Right.
The worst thing they can say is no or nothing, if it's a unsolicited, DM. Like, the worst they can do is ignore you, but you might as well ask, if you can, poke at their thoughts a little bit and see how they achieve the success that you want.
Absolutely. And I think another question before we go on to the second part that I think is important to talk about for you specifically, LA, is that besides being an author, you're also and I had a chance to look at this before the interview, you're actually part of a group of people, which I think is very awesome. And I'm probably going to butcher the name or get it wrong, but would you like to share with our viewers and listeners the group of people that you are a part of? I think it's some form of like an editing service or publishing service of some kind.
So we're the 11th Hour Literary Journal. So it's run out of Binghamton University. It's where we all work. And so we have 2 editions a year, and our whole ethos is that, people get rejected all the time. We submit to journals, we submit to editors, we submit to publishing, we all get rejections. But that doesn't mean that your writing journey should end, and that doesn't mean that piece isn't worth publishing. So our journal specifically only accepts pieces that have been rejected by other people. That's why we're 11th Hour. It's like, you've tried to get this piece published and you believe in this piece because, as we've seen from all our submissions, like, they're good pieces. It's just, journals are, you get thousands of submissions and you only have 10 spaces. to fill. So good pieces are going to be rejected. And so our idea was to give a place where those pieces have a chance to be published again, as everything is, that we're not the only place that takes rejected short stories and poems, but that is entirely what we accept. We don't accept like debut, like this piece has only ever been read by you. I wrote it specifically for your journal. We don't accept those pieces. We want you to try somewhere else. And if you're rejected, to rework it, and we'll look at it. And we have some really amazing pieces coming out. Our next edition comes out in June. And it's fully available free online to read. So it's a really exciting project. I've been having a ton of fun with it. I'm one of the editors and readers for that. So that's been a really fascinating way to get another look at, what publishing is like and what editors, experience. And I have a lot more, I think, perspective when I'm submitting my own work, to a journal or to a publishing house or an agent. Like, I absolutely they're getting a ton of submissions. I don't feel bad anymore when I get rejected. I'm like, okay, my piece might be trash, but I don't think it is. And I just have to try again somewhere else because clearly the timing just wasn't perfect. I was going up against amazing pieces, that's just, it happens.
That's very true. That is very true, especially in the query trenches, as that's a term I have heard from numerous authors who have done that. I've tried it. It's not easy.
It's not easy.
It does suck very, very much, LA.
Yeah. And there's good pieces being rejected. I'm not going to pretend every author is the best. Like, there are some people that are not writing good pieces, and that's okay. They need to practice and edit it. That doesn't mean it's not going to get there. It's my first drafts are awful. I don't let anyone look at them. So it's just, you just got to keep trying. There's so much out there and there's so much competition for attention. You just need to work on you and get your own writing to the best place it can be.
Definitely. And it also helps to have a good group of people to really help you hone your writing along the way, whether that's, fellow beta readers, ARC readers, authors, editors, whoever, and they're invaluable. Their insight, their perspective, they can help you look at things you never considered. All those are essential tools for authors. So for you, LA, are there any people in your inner circle that you like to give a personal shout out to who have helped you along the way?
Absolutely. I mean, my writing group is phenomenal. We're a rather big group, but they all have such amazing feedback and such attention to detail when they read my work, and I truly appreciate all the feedback that I've gotten from every piece that I've brought to them. They're all so talented. It's amazing. And then my husband reads everything I write, so the next book is going to be dedicated to him because I could not have written it without him. Largely because, I sit down and I write for 2 to 3 hours at night, and that's time that he spends with our daughter so that I can have that time. And it's just the most valuable gift I could have gotten over the last year that I've been working on this. And he reads the genre as well. So his feedback is also just utterly phenomenal. So my husband has been great. My editor, Ethan, who was working on my second book with me right now, is phenomenal. His work is always exceptional. It's just been, I have a really good support network, and I couldn't be more grateful for them.
That's amazing, LA. That is incredible to hear. And we now arrive at the final question of this amazing interview. And I will tell you this right now, LA, brace yourselves, because it's a very loaded question and a very thought-provoking question. So for context for this question, I've been doing this show now for about 6-7 years. And, within the time period, I interviewed a lot of authors from indie, hybrid, traditional, breaking down to aspiring, debuting, returning, what have you. And I've learned a lot from everyone. And I've come to realize in the publishing industry for authors, there are usually two paths, or I should say there are only two paths: to be an author, to be known as an author. One is dedicated to the story, and the craft itself. The other is dedicated to the marketing aspect, the building of the brand. And both lead to the same goal, which is success, world literacy acclaim, what have you, and the end game, some would say. But I definitely feel in the publishing industry, the second path to be known as an author is the most enticing and
Mhm.
leads to a lot of unrealistic goals and expectations. And the harsh truth of the matter is, in this industry, there is no guarantee your first book is going to be an overnight success or a financial success. It
Yeah.
sucks to say that, but it is true. Are there exceptions to the rule? Absolutely. There are many authors whose first works did launch their careers. All the power to them. But that's not an easy thing to do for your average author. And 9 times out of 10, you are going to have books that aren't going to sell, even if those are the books you put the most time and heart and effort into it.
Mhm.
But even with that said, you can still grow and learn to adapt over time. Maybe it wasn't the genre that you were writing in that was the best. Maybe you work in this field or in that avenue, what have you. It's all a learning experience. So here's a hypothetical scenario, LA. Let's say you're at a conference and you've met a young aspiring author who's down on their luck. They've been working on a story for a very long time, and they've done everything, they've done the work, they've put forth the effort, but it didn't meet their expectations,
Mhm.
and they're down on their luck. How would you console them, reassuring them that yes, this industry is not a guarantee, it's a 50-50 chance, but you shouldn't see this as a negative. You should be seen as a learning experience because grit transforms into talent.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree, and that's probably the essence of what I would say. Like ultimately, if you have that passion to write, you should just keep writing. Like people say that all the time, and I know it can be really condescending, and that's not how I mean it. Like you have a phenomenal story in you. It just might take a little more time, a little more tweaking. You might need another perspective on the story. Something I did was, I kind of abandoned the story and I wrote something else, played with other ideas, and then I came back to it. And those other ideas really helped me figure out where this story was going. So you might just need to take a little break and come back, reassess things. Things might just take the right, you might have to be there at the right time. You might need the right inciting event, meet the right person, to get it out into the world successfully in your eyes. And I would always encourage people to just truly, think about why you want to write the book. Like if you're trying to, get that multi-million-dollar publishing deal and you want the movie adaptation and all that, you might need to adjust a little bit what your goals are. But if your goal is just to have people read your story and to have it be there and be something that you're proud of, I think anyone can do that. I think, you just need to work at it and to want it. And to, work around your own situation, your own boundaries, like however you are getting your writing out there, you can do it. It's just, you need to know yourself in order to do that successfully.
Well said, LA. Well said indeed. And with that, viewers and listeners, we conclude another amazing author interview here on the show. I want to give a huge thank you to our guest, LA Garnett, for making her official debut here on the show. We wish her the very best with the launch of her second book in her series, which comes out this fall. Now, LA, where can people find you on social media if they wanted to reach out and connect? Yeah. And where can people buy the first book in the series to get themselves ready for book 2?
Absolutely. So I'm on Instagram at LA Garnett author. Also have a website, lagarnett.com. You're more than welcome to check me out at either. I've been taking a bit of a breather from social media for the last couple months, but I'm coming back to it now with the new book coming out relatively soon. Really gearing myself up for that marketing push for me. But I'm really excited to talk with everyone and see how they like the first book, which you can find online anywhere you buy books online. And you can order a print copy through Barnes & Noble and Amazon.
Awesome. I will link all those down below in the description of this video. Thank you everyone for joining us for another amazing author interview here on the show. A huge thank you to L.A. Garnett for making your official debut here on the show. And just a little announcement, viewers and listeners, we have 2 final episodes for the month of May, which will be coming out later this week. So be on the lookout for that. And as always, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe down below. And until next time, this is the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill signing out, wishing you all a wonderful day wherever you are in the world, and we'll see you all in the next episode.